Under the blood-red skies of Renaris Prime, war had come without warning. The ground shook under the impact of plasma shells, and the air burned with the scent of scorched metal. The Empire's forces clashed with the Coalition in a battle that had no front lines, only chaos. Soldiers stumbled over rubble, firing blindly through the smoke. In the middle of the carnage, one human soldier moved with a strange calm, his uniform dusted with ash, his eyes fixed ahead like a man who feared nothing. His name was Daniel Rook, a newly assigned guard for the Coalition's diplomatic forces. He had been sent to Renaris with orders to protect the most valuable asset in the war, an alien queen who held the loyalty of half the outer systems. Few humans had even seen her. The stories said she was as dangerous as she was beautiful, a ruler whose word could shatter fleets. The enemy wanted her dead. Her own people kept her sealed away, and yet, somehow, Daniel was walking toward her court as if he had been born for this. The grand hall of the Rhinari Palace was like stepping into another world. Golden banners shimmered in the high light of crystal chandeliers. The marble floor reflected the armored guards who lined the walls. At the far end sat Queen Sarathis, the alien monarch whose presence silenced the room. Her skin was the green of deep emerald, her long hair braided in regal purple strands that caught the light. Her golden armor gleamed, every curve shaped to fit her as if forged by worshippers. Her eyes were sharp, the kind that could measure a man's worth in a single glance. Daniel had been warned that no human, or alien, dared sit beside her throne. That place was reserved for no one. Those who tried were met with silence, humiliation, or exile. It was a throne of isolation, and the queen had made it clear she needed no equal. But Daniel didn't hesitate. As the court whispered, he strode forward, boots clicking against the marble, and took the empty seat beside her as if it had been waiting for him all along. A ripple of shock spread through the chamber. Rhinari guards gripped their weapons, eyes narrowing at the human who had just broken a law older than their empire. Ministers exchanged tense glances. The air thickened, every heartbeat louder than the last. The queen turned her head, her eyes meeting his. And for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "You have courage," she said, her voice low but carrying through the hall. "Or you have no understanding of the danger you are in." Her words were not a threat, but a test. Daniel didn't flinch. He simply met her gaze, his tone steady as he replied that he had been sent to guard her, and a guard did not protect. From the shadows, if she was to be safe, he would be at her side, not behind her. It was a simple answer, but it shifted something in the room. The guards eased their grips, though their eyes stayed wary. The minister stopped whispering. Queen Sarathis's gaze lingered on Daniel for longer than was proper, her expression unreadable. She turned back to the court, but a faint trace of a smile touched her lips, gone before anyone could be certain it had been there. From that moment, the human and the alien queen became the center of every rumor in the palace. Some said he was reckless. Others claimed he was part of a deeper plan, but in the shadows beyond the throne room, there were those who saw something far more dangerous. A human who had crossed a line no one dared, and an alien queen who had not stopped him. The palace had not been quiet since that day. Every step Daniel took inside its walls seemed to stir whispers. The Rhinari nobles were not used to seeing a human stride through their corridors without a bow or a glance downward. Yet Daniel did neither. His eyes stayed forward, his boots clicking against the polished floors, and his posture told everyone he feared nothing they could do to him. Some called it arrogance, others bravery. But all agreed it was dangerous. Queen Sarathis had not spoken to him again in public since the day he sat beside her. She kept her tone cool in council meetings, addressing him only when protocol demanded. Still, Daniel noticed the subtle shifts in her gaze. He saw how she would sometimes glance his way when others were speaking, how her lips would tighten when ministers complained about the human presence at her side. She never told him to leave. She never once ordered him to stand behind her throne like the others wanted. The human guard's presence had also caught the attention of those beyond the palace. The Renari High Command, already stretched thin by the war, began to question why their queen allowed a foreign soldier such closeness. Political opponents called him a distraction. Yet, in the dark halls where true power moved, some began to fear that Daniel's loyalty might extend beyond his orders. His refusal to bend to court politics made him harder to control. And if the queen trusted him, it could mean the start of something they couldn't predict. Daniel was not blind to the tension. He had been in enough war zones to recognize when a line was being drawn. But he also knew the war outside the palace was far deadlier than the one inside it. Reports from the front lines painted a grim picture. The coalition's forces were losing ground. Enemy fleets were pushing deeper into Rhinari space. If the queen fell, so would the last barrier protecting the outer colonies. To Danielle, that meant his place was not just beside her. It was in her path, shielding her from whatever came. One evening, as the twin moons cast silver light over the marble courtyard, Daniel found himself summoned to the queen's private chambers. It was not common for anyone to receive such an invitation without weeks of formal notice. When he entered, the guards at her door stepped back silently, their eyes unreadable. Inside, Queen Serathis stood by a wide window, the city below glowing like a sea of stars. She didn't turn when she spoke, her voice calm but carrying weight. "Do you know why no one sits beside me?" she asked. Daniel didn't answer right away. He knew any response would reveal more about him than about her. When he finally spoke, his words were simple. "Because they believe you don't need anyone there." She turned to face him then, her eyes sharp, the faintest curve of a smile tugging at her lips. "And do you believe that?" she asked. He met her gaze and answered without hesitation. "I believe even a queen deserves someone who will not leave her side." For a moment, the room was silent except for the hum of the city beyond the windows. Then, with deliberate grace, she walked to her throne in the center of the chamber. It was smaller than the one in the great hall, but still carried an air of command. She sat, her golden armor catching the moonlight, and gestured to the empty seat beside her. "Then take your place," she said, and just as he had on that first day, Daniel crossed the space without hesitation and sat down. From the street below, no one could see them. From the corridors outside, the court could only guess. But in that private moment, the alien queen and the human guard sat side by side, two figures from different worlds bound not by law or tradition, but by something far more dangerous: mutual trust. The next morning, the court was restless. Word had spread that the human guard had been seen leaving the queen's private wing long after midnight. No one knew why he had been there or what had been discussed. Ministers speculated in hushed voices. Guards traded glances in the corridors. The nobility avoided Daniel's path, their expressions a mix of disdain and unease. To them, his very presence was becoming an insult to centuries of Rhinari tradition. Daniel ignored the stares. He had learned early in his career that a soldier's job was not to win approval, but to complete the mission. His mission was clear: protect the queen at any cost. Whether that meant intercepting threats in the throne room or standing watch in the shadows of her private gardens, he was prepared. What he had not expected was how often those threats came not from enemies outside the walls, but from the very people sworn to serve her. In the days that followed, the palace became a battlefield of words. Certain ministers began to push for Daniel's removal, claiming his proximity to the queen undermined Rhinari authority. A few went so far as to suggest that humans could not be trusted to guard alien royalty. Yet, every time the motion was brought before the queen, she dismissed it without hesitation. Her reasoning was simple. Daniel had proven himself loyal in a way many of her own kind had not. It was during one such council meeting that the first real danger appeared. A messenger arrived from the front lines, carrying an encrypted data, a crystal. As the queen reached to accept it, Daniel noticed the faint flicker of red along its surface, a telltale sign of a concealed explosive. Without warning, he stepped between her and the device, grabbing it from the messenger's hands and hurling it into the reinforced containment pit in the corner of the hall. The detonation shook the room, scattering sparks across the marble floor. The court erupted into chaos. Guards rushed forward, weapons drawn, surrounding the messenger. Ministers shouted over one another, demanding answers. Queen Sarathis stood from her throne, her gaze fixed on Daniel. For a moment, no one spoke. Then she descended the steps and stood before him, her voice cutting through the noise like steel. "You saw it before anyone else," she said. "You saved my life." Daniel simply nodded. "That is my duty," he replied. The would-be assassin was dragged away for interrogation, but the damage had been done. The attack proved what Daniel had suspected. There were enemies inside the palace as well as outside. It also made something else clear to the court. Removing him from the queen's side was no longer a matter of politics, but a matter of survival. No one dared raise the issue again in her presence. That night, Daniel stood watch on the palace balcony overlooking the city. The sky was alive with streaks of light from distant battles, each one a reminder of how close the war was to reaching them. Footsteps approached behind him, soft and deliberate. He turned to see Queen Sarathis, her armor replaced by a flowing cloak that shimmered in the torchlight. She studied him for a moment before speaking. "You acted without hesitation today. Why?" Daniel met her eyes. "Because hesitation gets people killed," he said. She stepped closer, the city's light casting her features in gold and shadow. "Most who serve me think of their own safety first," she said. "You think of mine." There was no question in her tone, only observation. Daniel gave a faint smile. "That's what it means to guard someone," he replied. For a moment, her expression softened, and then she turned her gaze back to the city. They stood there in silence, two figures on the edge of a world at war, bound by an unspoken understanding that neither could afford to lose. The palace walls felt heavier with each passing day. Rumors of further assassination attempts spread among the guards, and the air inside the great halls grew tense. Servants moved quickly, keeping their heads down. Ministers spoke in coded phrases, fearful of being overheard. Daniel remained at the queen's side through it all, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, as if danger might step out at any moment. Queen Sarathis carried herself as if none of it troubled her, but Daniel had learned to read the subtle changes in her posture, the way her fingers tightened on the armrest of her throne during council meetings, the rare flicker of her eyes toward the doors when a stranger entered. She was a ruler under siege, not just by armies beyond the stars, but by betrayal within her own court. And yet, she never faltered in front of her people. The next blow came during a formal banquet meant to reassure the nobles. The grand dining hall glittered with golden chandeliers, polished silverware, and tables laden with alien delicacies. Laughter and music filled the air, but Daniel never allowed himself to relax. His instincts screamed that something was wrong. When the queen's goblet was set before her, he noticed a faint shimmer on the surface of the drink, almost invisible to the untrained eye. He reached out, took the cup from her hand, and poured it onto the marble floor. The liquid hissed as it touched stone, burning through the polished surface. Gasps echoed through the hall. Some nobles leapt to their feet. Others froze in shock. Daniel's hand went to his sidearm as his eyes swept the room. The queen remained seated, her gaze sharp, scanning the faces of those present. "Someone here," she said in a voice cold enough to chill the air, "has forgotten the price of treachery." Guards moved swiftly, detaining the servant who had delivered the goblet. The banquet ended in silence, the music cut short as guests left with fear in their eyes. That night, in her private chamber, Queen Sarathis dismissed the guards and asked Daniel to stay. She paced slowly across the room, the soft fabric of her gown brushing the floor. "Twice now you have kept me alive," she said, her tone measured. Tell me, human, do you expect a reward? Daniel shook his head. No, he said. I expect the war to end, and you to still be here when it does. Her expression softened for a moment before she turned away, hiding the hint of emotion in her eyes. From that moment on, the Queen began involving Daniel in matters that went beyond his role as a guard. She asked his opinion on troop movements, on supply lines, on the morale of the soldiers stationed in the capital. It was as if she had begun to see him not just as a protector, but as an advisor. Some in the court noticed and did not like it. Whispers of the human influence began to circulate, spoken with bitterness and fear. Daniel knew those whispers were dangerous. The more power the court thought he had, the more they would work to remove him. But he also knew that turning down the Queen's trust would weaken her position. Every suggestion he gave was aimed at keeping her alive and her rule stable. He understood now that his presence at her side was no longer just about guarding her from physical harm. It was about guarding her from the slow poison of politics that could destroy her from within. The war beyond the palace walls showed no sign of slowing. Reports came daily of new enemy advances, of cities falling under siege. And yet, inside the palace, a different kind of battle was being fought. One for loyalty, for trust, and for the future of an empire that could crumble from the inside before the enemy ever breached its gates. The weeks that followed were a constant test of loyalty and endurance. Every day Daniel faced the same unspoken challenge: prove himself worthy to remain at the Queen's side. The Rhinari court had not stopped watching him, and every gesture he made was weighed and judged. Yet he refused to let their stares or muttered words slow him. His duty was to her, not to their pride or politics. Queen Sarathis seemed more at ease in his presence than she had been before. On certain mornings, she would walk with him through the palace gardens, her hands clasped behind her back as she spoke of strategy and the war's progress. Daniel noticed she never spoke idly. Every word carried purpose, as though she wanted him to understand the burden she carried as ruler. These walks became a quiet ritual, one that neither announced, but both seemed to rely on. The tension within the palace, however, was reaching a breaking point. Supplies were running low in the capital. The people's faith in their leaders was being tested. Several border outposts had fallen to the enemy, and refugees were streaming into the city. The court demanded harsher measures: curfews, forced labor, ration cuts. But the Queen resisted, refusing to punish her own people to please fearful ministers. It was a decision that earned her admiration among the citizens, but it deepened the resentment of her political rivals. One night, Daniel was stationed just outside the council chamber when raised voices reached his ears. He recognized several ministers, their words sharp with anger. They accused the Queen of weakness, of allowing the war to drag on out of sentiment. One voice spoke more venomously than the rest, insisting that if she would not act, the council should remove her by force. Daniel didn't wait for orders. He stepped into the chamber, his presence cutting their voices short, and warned them that any move against the Queen would be met with consequences they could not imagine. The ministers did not reply. Their eyes shifted between him and each other, calculating whether his threat was only words. The Queen, seated at the head of the table, remained silent, her gaze steady on him. When the council finally dismissed for the night, she lingered behind, walking to where he stood. "You put yourself between me and them," she said softly. "You risked more than you realize." Daniel met her eyes. "I'll risk whatever I must," he answered. The following day, a message arrived from the front lines. An enemy strike force had breached the defensive perimeter, and a forward command post was under siege. The Queen's generals argued over whether to send reinforcements or retreat and fortify the capital. Daniel, listening from his position, suggested a third option: dispatching a small strike team to disrupt the enemy's supply route. It was risky, but if it succeeded, the siege could be broken without pulling troops from other fronts. The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to the Queen. She studied Daniel for a long moment before nodding. "Do it!" she ordered her generals. The decision stunned the council. No one could recall a time when a human guard's advice had been taken as military strategy. Some were furious, but the queen ignored their outrage. That night, she summoned Daniel to the balcony overlooking the city. "You've become more than a guard," she told him. "You've become my ally." Her words carried weight, and Daniel knew they marked a turning point. From that day forward, his role changed. He was still her protector, but now he was also her confidant, her sounding board, and the one voice she trusted in a room full of political snakes. It was a role that put him in more danger than any battlefield, for the enemies plotting against the queen were no longer just soldiers beyond the stars. They were the ones who walked these same halls under the guise of loyalty. The capital city's skies burned orange as news arrived of another enemy advance. The palace was bracing for the possibility of a direct strike, and every guard was on edge. Daniel remained near the queen at all times, his eyes scanning for the smallest sign of threat. It had been months since he first took the seat beside her, but in that time, the list of those who wanted him gone had only grown. To them, he was not just a guard. He was a disruption to centuries of order. Queen Sarathis did not waver under the pressure. She addressed her people in the great square, her voice carrying strength even in the face of looming danger. Daniel stood just a step behind her, watching the crowd. Among the banners and cheering voices, he could see pockets of unrest, faces that did not share in the hope she offered. He made a silent note of them, knowing that not all enemies wore uniforms. Some smiled while hiding the knife. That evening, a secret meeting was called in the war council chamber. Only the queen, Daniel, and her most trusted generals were present. Reports showed the enemy had found a weakness in the planetary defense grid, and an attack was imminent. The generals argued over the best course of action, but Daniel stepped forward with a plan. Strike first, using a diversionary fleet to draw the enemy into a trap while ground forces secured the capital. It was bold, dangerous, and it left little margin for error. The queen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she rose from her chair and walked to the map display. Her eyes traced the lines of the proposed attack, and slowly, she nodded. "We will do it," she said. The generals exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to speak against her decision. Daniel knew the weight of what she had agreed to. If they failed, the enemy would be at their gates within hours. If they succeeded, the war's momentum could change in their favor. Preparations began immediately. Ships were fueled, weapons were loaded, and soldiers were briefed. The queen ordered Daniel to remain in the command center with her, but he refused. "If this plan works," he said, "it will be because every piece moved into place. I need to be on the ground to make sure it happens." She hesitated, then gave a slow nod, the smallest trace of worry flickering in her eyes. It was the first time she had let him see that fear. The battle began at dawn. The diversionary fleet launched, pulling enemy forces into deep space. On the ground, Daniel led the strike team through the city's lower districts, securing key access points. To prevent sabotage, blaster fire lit the streets as enemy infiltrators tried to break through. Daniel fought with a precision born from years in the field, his focus unshakable. Every step forward was a step toward protecting the one person he had sworn to keep safe. Hours later, the sound of distant explosions began to fade. Reports came in. The trap had worked. The enemy fleet had taken the bait, suffering heavy losses. Ground forces loyal to the queen had secured the city's perimeter. The war was not over, but for the first time in months, the people of the capital could breathe without the weight of immediate fear. Daniel returned to the palace, his armor scorched and his uniform torn, but alive. In the throne room, Queen Sarathis rose from her seat as he entered. The court watched in silence as she stepped down the marble steps and stood before him. "You have given my people a victory they will remember," she said, her voice carrying through the hall. Then, in front of her ministers, guards, and nobles, she did something no one expected. She took his hand and raised it for all to see. "This human," she declared, has earned his place beside me for as long as I rule. The days following the victory were filled with both celebration and suspicion. The people of the capital hailed the queen's leadership and the bravery of the human who had fought at her side. Streets were decorated with banners, and merchants spoke Daniel's name as if it had become a symbol of defiance. But inside the palace, the mood was far more guarded. Some nobles viewed the victory as proof of his growing influence, and influence was something they could not control. Daniel noticed the shift in the way certain ministers watched him. Their smiles were polite, but their eyes were cold. He had seen the same look in enemy soldiers who were already planning their next move. It was not the gaze of allies. Queen Cerathis, however, did not appear concerned. She spoke to him as openly as ever, often asking for his thoughts on matters far beyond his duties as a guard. Each time she did, the room seemed to tighten with tension. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Daniel was summoned to a small council meeting. The queen was already there, seated at the head of the table, flanked by a few of her closest Alhu advisors. On the table lay a single sealed document, marked with the insignia of the enemy's ruling council. It was an offer, an invitation to discuss peace. But there was a condition attached. The human who guarded the queen would have to be removed from her side before the talks could begin. The room fell into silence as the meaning sank in. One of the advisors argued that the condition was a small price to pay for ending the war. Another suggested that Daniel could be reassigned quietly to avoid public scandal. Queen Cerathis listened without interruption, her eyes fixed on the parchment. Finally, she looked up, her gaze meeting Daniel's. "What would you have me do?" she asked. His answer was calm. "You should do what is best for your people, even if that means sending me away." Her eyes narrowed slightly at his words, but she did not reply. Instead, she stood and dismissed the council for the night, keeping Daniel behind. When the doors closed, she stepped closer, her voice lower. "You would leave, even knowing what that would mean for me?" Daniel met her gaze without hesitation. "If it kept you alive and ended this war, yes." For a long moment, she studied him in silence, as if weighing not just his words but the truth behind them. The next morning, the queen made her decision, but public. Standing in the great hall before the court and assembled citizens, she announced that the peace talks would proceed, but not on the enemy's terms. "This guard," she said, gesturing to Daniel, "has risked more for me than anyone in this chamber. If they will not speak while he stands at my side, then they do not wish for true peace." The hall erupted with murmurs, half in outrage, half in awe. The rejection of the offer sent ripples across the political landscape. Some called it reckless. Others saw it as a sign of strength. For Daniel, it was a reminder of the dangerous path they now walked. The enemy would see the refusal as defiance, and the factions within the palace that wanted him gone would grow bolder. But he also understood something else. The queen had made a choice that tied her fate to his in a way that could not easily be undone. That night, as the city lights flickered under the dark sky, Daniel stood on the balcony overlooking the streets below. Queen Cerathis joined him, her steps silent against the polished stone. They stood side by side without speaking, the air between them heavy with the knowledge of what was to come. Whatever trials awaited, they would face them together, and neither would yield to fear or doubt. The tension inside the palace reached its peak as enemy forces began massing on the outskirts of the capital. Spies reported that this would not be a siege meant to negotiate. It would be a decisive strike to crush the queen's rule entirely. The court scrambled to prepare, but fear was an invisible current running through every hall. Daniel remained calm, standing watch beside the throne, as if nothing in the galaxy could shake him. Queen Cerathis called a final war council, gathering her generals, advisors, and a handful of trusted guards. Maps and holographic displays filled the room, marking enemy movements in glowing red. Every voice in the chamber carried urgency. But beneath their words was doubt. The enemy had more troops, more ships, and more firepower. Victory would require more than strategy. It would demand resolve. All eyes turned to the queen, waiting for her decision. She spoke with the clarity of a ruler who had accepted the cost of her choice. "We fight," she said. "We do not yield our city, and we do not bend to demands born of fear." Her words lit a fire in the room, yet Daniel saw the danger behind them. The enemy would throw everything into this attack, and if they broke through, there would be no retreat. He stepped forward, offering a plan to hold the city by dividing the defenders into swift-moving units, rather than locking them into static lines. The generals hesitated, but the queen gave the order. Daniel was to lead the central defense, the most vulnerable position, where the enemy's advance would hit hardest. He accepted without hesitation. At dawn, the battle erupted. The sound of weapons fire and the roar of engines shook the air as soldiers clashed in the streets. Daniel moved through the chaos like a force of nature, rallying defenders, cutting down attackers, and never once leaving the heart of the fight. The enemy pressed forward with relentless force. But Daniel's tactics slowed them at every turn. He directed barricades to be moved, traps to be sprung, and flanking strikes to hit where the enemy least expected. Hours stretched into what felt like days. Smoke and fire filled the air, but the line held. By the time reinforcements from the outer districts arrived, the enemy's assault had begun to crumble. The capital still stood, and its queen remained safe within its walls. When the surviving enemy forces finally retreated, the city erupted in relief. Citizens poured into the streets, cheering not just for the victory, but for the defiance it represented. In the throne room, Queen Sarathis stood before the assembled court. She spoke of bravery, sacrifice, and the strength of those who refused to submit. Then, turning to Daniel, she called him forward and placed a ceremonial clasp upon his shoulder, marking him not only as her guard, but as an honored protector of the realm. The court watched in silence, many with expressions they could not hide. Some were grudgingly respectful. Others still harbored resentment, but none could deny what had been proven. Daniel had earned his place beside the queen through action, not title. He had faced threats from within and without, and he had stood firm when others faltered. His presence at her side was no longer a breach of tradition. It was a shield that tradition could not provide. That night, the city was lit with celebration. Fires burned in great bowls along the streets, and music carried on the wind. From the balcony of the palace, Daniel and Queen Sarathis looked out over the glowing city they had defended together. They said nothing, for words were no longer needed. In that silence, they understood what the court, the people, and even the enemy now knew. No one would ever again question the human who sat beside the alien queen.